Some windows conceal the past, not with curtains, but with shame. Tonight's story unfolds on a quiet April evening in Baker Street, where a child long thought dead is found behind a wall. And justice wears a face far more polite than righteous. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us unlock the door they never meant to open. It was upon a grey March morning, the sort that muffles both footstep and spirit, that I sat across from Holmes in our lodgings at Baker Street, watching the slender trails of smoke curl upward from his pipe, like question marks without answers. The fire had not yet burned high, and the windows bore a film of condensation that made the street beyond appear distant and unreal. Holmes, deep in abstraction, had not spoken for the better part of an hour. I had come to know these silences well, not as voids, but as the fertile quiet in which his mind performed its most intricate gymnastics. The rattle of a hansom and the light but hurried knock at our door broke the hush. Mrs. Hudson admitted a young lady, scarcely more than 25, her gloves damp with mist, and her manner uncertain, as though she half regretted her visit. She stood in the doorway with a gaze that clung to Holmes with something between desperation and disbelief. He rose at once, gestured to the chair nearest the fire, and said gently, "Pray compose yourself, madam. You are safe here." She seated herself slowly, her hands trembling as she removed her veil. Beneath it was a pale, intelligent face, with the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had endured solitude too long. "My name is Isabel Venn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am the resident governess at Renston Grange, in Sussex." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who offered no interruption. He only leaned forward slightly, the tip of his fingers pressed together, his expression unreadable. "I would not have come," she continued, "had I not feared that silence would do more harm than speaking. I have seen something that cannot be explained." She paused, searching the air for courage. "For the past 5 nights, always at the same hour, I have looked up toward the east wing of the house, a wing that I was told is uninhabited, and I have seen a girl standing at the window, watching." "The same girl each time?" Holmes asked softly. "Yes," she said. "Always the same outline, the same stillness. The light is faint, but unmistakable. I can describe her dress, even the tilt of her head." Her breath caught in her throat. "But the master of the house insists that the east wing has been sealed for over a decade." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And yet the girl returns." Miss Venn nodded. "I had to come. I could not bear to look away again." "You must understand, Dr. Watson," Miss Venn said, turning to me now, "that Renston Grange is a place of long shadows and long silences. The east wing is avoided even by the servants. It has not been opened, so they say, since the death of the master's daughter, Eliza, 11 years ago." "Eliza Cowishaw," Holmes murmured, retrieving a small notebook from the table and writing the name without comment. "I was told she died of consumption," Miss Venn went on, "and that the wing was sealed thereafter. Out of sorrow, they claimed, but I know what I saw. I cannot doubt it now. Each evening, at precisely 9:15, the curtain in the third window from the left is drawn slightly back, and there, behind the glass, stands the child." "Describe her," said Holmes. Miss Venn closed her eyes. "Slim, pale, a white ribbon in her hair. She does not move, only watches. It is as though she waits for something, or someone." Holmes tapped his pencil lightly against his knee. "And you are quite certain the wing remains locked?" "I have attempted entry twice. The corridor is blocked by a heavy oak door, bolted on the outer side and covered in dust. No one has passed that way. Not openly." Holmes's eyes gleamed for a moment, though his voice remained impassive. "Yet someone, or something, does pass that way. That is clear." Miss Venn's expression darkened. "When I first mentioned it to Mr. Cowishaw, he dismissed it outright. He laughed, not kindly, and suggested that the dusk and my nerves had conspired to deceive me. Mr. Francis Cowishaw, Holmes interjected, formerly a magistrate in Chichester, retired, I believe, under somewhat unclear circumstances. Miss Venn looked startled. Yes, how did you… But Holmes only waved his hand. Please continue. He is not unkind, she said cautiously, but he is exacting. The staff fear him, though they would not admit it. He insists upon quiet and on the strict separation of servants' duties. I am not permitted to enter the east side of the house beyond my rooms. He once told me, quite plainly, that the past must not be stirred, that some doors, once closed, are better left shut. Holmes smiled thinly. A man of sentiment, then, but only where it suits him. Miss Venn's fingers clenched in her lap. I have not seen the girl's face clearly, but last night she raised her hand. Slowly, as if to touch the glass, or to beckon. Holmes rose and paced slowly to the window, his eyes fixed not on the street, but on the subtle fog patterns playing across the glass. And this window, you say it is third from the left in the east wing. Yes. At what distance, and at what height above ground? Roughly 20 feet. I can see it clearly from the garden path just beyond the yew hedge. Is there any tree or scaffold nearby, which might cast a shadow upon the pane? None. The ground slopes away there. It is the highest part of the house. Holmes turned back, his expression unreadable. And the curtain, does it move each evening of its own accord, or only when the girl is seen? Only when she appears, Miss Venn replied. The curtain is otherwise still, but at 9:15, almost to the second, it draws back. Holmes glanced at the clock above the hearth. And the light, is it constant? Only a soft lamp, dim but warm. Holmes returned to his chair and steepled his fingers. Miss Venn, you are not the victim of illusion, nor of fancy. The architecture may be sealed, but the truth is not. And something, or someone, seeks to be seen. The question, then, is, by whom? Miss Venn hesitated, then spoke with sudden urgency. I kept it to myself at first. I believed it was my imagination, or a grief that lingered in the walls. But when I saw her hand, Doctor, when I saw it rise, palm against the glass, as though she were pleading, I could no longer doubt. Watson shifted uneasily beside me. And you told no one else? She shook her head. Only you. I fear Cowishaw would dismiss me entirely. Or worse, dismiss me from the house. Holmes tapped the arm of his chair. Once. Twice. You have done wisely. And more. You have done bravely. The truth may lie buried in time, but it casts shadows even still, and shadows may be traced. Holmes stood at last and moved to the hearth, where he lit a fresh match and let it burn down to his fingers before extinguishing it. Watson, it seems we are to spend a few days in Sussex. I had rather guessed, I said, with a glance at Miss Venn, whose posture now carried the slightest suggestion of hope. Holmes turned toward the window, peering through the gauze of mist that clung to the panes. There is more in the silence of windows than in their opening, he said quietly, for what does not cry out may still accuse. And with that enigmatic phrase, he turned back to the fire, his eyes already distant, not with detachment, but with the uncanny clarity of a man who sees in darkness what others miss in the light. The case had begun, and already I felt it would not leave us untouched. Our journey to Renston Grange took place beneath a ceiling of unbroken grey, the sort of sky which renders the world below it peculiarly silent, as though sound itself were reluctant to disturb the solemn stillness. The air was heavy with a damp chill, and the fields of Sussex, with their hedgerows drawn taut across the landscape, passed by our carriage like the pages of a half-forgotten story. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent, his gaze fixed not on the scenery, but somewhere inward as though already pacing the corridors of a house he had not yet entered. "I take it you've deduced something of our host," I ventured, more to stir the air than out of any true expectation. He did not look at me, but replied, "Francis Cowishaw was a magistrate of notable severity, particularly toward women accused of moral lapses. He retired following an incident at Petworth Assizes, details suppressed. His reputation was redrawn rather than restored." "And Renston Grange?" I asked. "A house with a reputation for drawing the curtains against time," he said almost absently. "A place where silence, I suspect, has been arranged." I said nothing further. The mists had thickened as we passed beneath an arch of half-dead trees, and the road narrowed until it felt more like an approach to a tomb than a home. It was a full 10 minutes before the house finally emerged from the veil of fog, and even then it did so reluctantly. A sullen, low-slung structure of ashlar stone, weather-beaten and withdrawn behind a skeletal row of sycamores. The carriage halted at a gravelled path that seemed scarcely used, and we disembarked into an atmosphere not of stillness, but of listening quiet. The door was opened by a woman of uncertain age, with a complexion as wan as the fog and eyes that did not meet ours. She said nothing, but bowed faintly and gestured us inward. The hall was dark and narrow, the air tinged with old wax and something drier, like paper gone brittle with age. No sooner had we removed our gloves than a voice cut through the hush. "You are early." We turned to see a man descending the staircase, his hand tight on the banister, his step measured. Francis Cowishaw was of medium height, grey-haired, with a build that had once known discipline, but now bore the weight of seclusion. His face was deeply lined, the mouth drawn into a shape that might once have suggested discernment, but had now hardened into disdain. "I was not aware this was a matter requiring your urgency," he said. "Miss Venn's letter was sufficient in its absurdity." Holmes offered the faintest bow. "I make it a rule never to ignore an appearance which contradicts the architecture." Cowlishaw's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. We were shown into a parlour lined with dark shelves and darker silences. The room into which we were ushered was furnished in the manner of a man who had once entertained, and no longer did. Books lined the walls, but their spines bore the same dust as the hearth, and the chairs were arranged not for conversation, but for surveillance. Cowishaw remained standing, arms crossed loosely behind his back, like a schoolmaster unwilling to be contradicted. "I presume," he began, "that you have been told of Miss Venn's sightings." "I have," Holmes replied evenly. "She believes she has seen a child in a wing of the house you have assured her is sealed. And I repeat that she is mistaken. That part of the house was shut after my daughter's death and remains so. There are no servants housed there, no lamps lit, no windows opened. She is overwrought. A sensitive mind in an isolated place. Nothing more." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And you would object to an inspection?" Cowlishaw's lips twitched. "I object to intrusions based on fancy. This is not a matter for Scotland Yard nor for theatre." He turned away. "You may remain the night, Mr. Holmes, but I will not have my household stirred for shadows." We were shown to a chamber on the house's western side, the hallway long and low-ceilinged, hung with portraits of forgotten relations whose eyes seemed drawn, invariably, toward the east. Holmes walked with apparent idleness, his gaze passing over the wall sconces, the uneven wooden floorboards, the spider-veined plaster near the cornices. Only once did he slow. Just beyond the bend, where a corridor veered subtly toward the sealed east wing, he paused as if to remove his gloves, yet his eyes were fixed on the floor. A narrow line of dust ran down the middle of the hall, except at one place, where the faintest of prints broke its uniformity. Not a footstep precisely, but a dragging mark, as though a shoe had twisted slightly while pivoting. Holmes bent, as if adjusting his boot, and I saw his gaze follow the trail to a point just beneath a curtained alcove, where a window stood half-shuttered. "There," he murmured as we resumed walking. "What did you observe?" He said nothing at first. Then, as we passed a low window opposite our door, he glanced back. The window facing the east wing has been cleaned. Is that remarkable? Only if you believe, as Mr. Cowishaw claims, that no one has entered that wing for 11 years. Dust, Watson, may lie, but glass rarely does. It requires a hand to wipe it. And with that quiet remark, he entered our room and began unpacking as though the house had already confessed its first lie. The corridor outside our chamber remained empty after nightfall, though the creak of the floorboards above suggested some part of the house continued to breathe its own rhythm. After supper, a quiet affair of bread and broth, Holmes took a lantern and suggested we acquaint ourselves further with the layout, under the pretext of relieving the close air of the parlour. We wandered down toward the hall we had passed earlier, and Holmes paused once more at the corridor leading to the east wing. There, nestled against the wall, as if discarded or forgotten, lay a small mirror, cracked, tarnished, and with a wooden frame bearing faded remnants of pink paint. It was the sort of object one might have found in a child's nursery. Holmes crouched and angled the lantern. The crack across the mirror's face ran diagonally, forming a distorted reflection of the opposite wall. He reached forward and gently tapped the frame. "Not dusted in some time," he said, more to himself than to me. I felt a chill, and not from the air. "It's unsettling," I murmured, as though a child once stood here, and might again. Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he said. We returned at length to our quarters, where Holmes took up a candle and a small notebook. While I occupied myself with unpacking, he began to pace the perimeter of the room with measured steps, pausing every so often to make small notations. The wind had risen outside, and the branches of the sycamores scratched faintly against the upper panes. "I take it you're mapping the house?" I asked. He nodded without looking up. "One must understand the arrangement of a place if one is to comprehend its deceptions. Architecture, Watson, is often more honest than the men who inhabit it. And what have you learned?" He paused, marking a cross on the paper. "That the east wing is not so far removed from the rest of the house as Cowishaw would have us believe. The walls do not listen, but they do lean." There was a silence between us then, filled by the rustling of leaves and the steady ticking of the mantel clock. "This house," Holmes said at last, "breathes in its own peculiar fashion, unevenly, as if dreaming a lie." I made no reply, for I could not help but feel that we had entered not merely a house, but a memory, and that memory was not yet finished speaking. It was the following morning when the first thread of shadow began to unravel itself. Holmes and I had risen early, as was his habit during investigations of a subtle nature, and taken tea in the parlour, a room that bore the scent of old velvet and unopened drawers. The fire had not yet been stoked, and the cold seemed to rise from the flagstones themselves, settling about the ankles with deliberate discomfort. The housemaid entered under the pretext of refreshing the hearth. She was a slim girl with fair hair drawn severely back, her gaze fixed always just to the left of one's eyes. Her speech was minimal, and when she addressed us it was with the muttered decorum of one who had long ago learned not to ask questions. Holmes, as ever, spoke not a word to her, at least not at first. He watched her movements, the order in which she tended the cinders, how her eyes flitted, always, away from the east-facing windows. "Have you been long in service here?" he asked, so lightly that it might have been mistaken for courtesy. 3 years, sir. And in that time, have you ever known a locked room to remain truly locked?" She faltered then, only for a moment, and murmured, "There are some places in this house, sir, where the key turns only in the memory of the master." Holmes inclined his head slightly, and the girl, having delivered her coal and her unspoken warning, departed. When we were once more alone, Miss Venn entered with a manner both purposeful and reserved, as though what she wished to say had been burdening her for days, but still fought to remain unsaid. She stood beside the fireplace and placed one gloved hand upon the mantelpiece. "I must tell you something I have kept to myself," she began, "though I scarcely know what to make of it." Holmes nodded without interrupting. 2 nights ago, I was returning from the library after the house had retired. I had borrowed a book, a trivial thing, and paused in the hall near the east corridor. I thought I heard music. She hesitated. A lullaby. Played or sung? Holmes asked. Neither, she said softly. It was mechanical, a child's music box perhaps. The sound was delicate, far off, but unmistakable. A few bars of it, no more. And then in silence. Was the tune familiar? Miss Venn's brow furrowed. Yes, I believe it was Lavender's Blue. Holmes glanced at me. A common nursery air, associated with affection or confinement. She looked down. It seemed to come from behind the wall, not through it, as if the wall itself remembered. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes, in his most neutral tone, asked, "And the servants, do they speak of Eliza Cowishaw?" Miss Venn's face tightened at the question. "Rarely," she replied, "and never with ease." Holmes rose and crossed to the windows, drawing back the drapes a fraction to inspect the morning light on the eastern facade. "Nevertheless, I should be obliged if you might arrange for the parlour-maid and the cook to speak with us discreetly, one at a time. I have found that truths too long buried resist being unearthed in company." It was the cook who came first. A stout woman with furrowed brows and a voice like clinking crockery. She insisted she had known nothing of Eliza beyond what had been said, that she had been delicate, often ill, and that her death had lifted a sorrow from the house. But what kind of sorrow? Holmes asked. The loss of a child, or the relief of an obligation? The woman flushed and said no more. The parlour-maid, a quieter sort, confessed under Holmes's steady gaze that the child had not been liked by the staff. "She watched, sir," the girl whispered, "always watched, even when she didn't speak." "And what did she see?" The girl hesitated. "She saw what made Mr. Cowishaw angry, and that was never safe." Holmes sat back. "Thank you," he said simply. As she withdrew, I looked at him and said, "And do you believe Eliza is the girl at the window?" He gave a thin smile. "I believe that Eliza may never have left the house at all." The following afternoon brought with it a deeper stillness than the day before, the kind not of peace, but of watchfulness, as though the very house had begun to take note of our presence. Holmes and I had wandered into the conservatory under the pretext of seeking air, though I knew it was part of his broader habit, to drift quietly through unfamiliar spaces until the fabric of the place began to reveal its loosened threads. It was there that we were formally introduced to Mr. Crail, a man who, though present throughout the household, had spoken not a single word since our arrival. The housekeeper, with a stiffness of tone that bordered on discomfort, informed us that he was dumb from birth, though I could not help but suspect that silence in Renston Grange had more than one cause. Crail was broad-shouldered, stooped slightly from age or labour, and bore on his belt a great ring of brass keys which clanked with every step he took. Most were rusted, some ornamental, a few modern and functional, but it was one, a small iron key with an oddly polished bit, that Holmes's gaze followed as it glinted against the dark cloth of the man's coat. Holmes approached Crail with casual familiarity, gesturing lightly toward the ring. "An impressive burden," he said, half smiling. "The weight of memory, no doubt." Crail did not respond, nor blink, but his hand moved instinctively over the keys, as if guarding them from being read like a diary. Holmes simply nodded and turned away, but I saw that he did not forget. Later that day, Holmes excused himself for a solitary walk about the lower corridors. I followed at some distance, allowing him the privacy he often preferred when in what I had come to recognise as his most delicate phase of deduction. Not the moment of analysis, but that of invitation when a place is permitted to speak. Near the end of the eastward corridor, where the lamps flickered and the hush seemed slightly unnatural, Holmes paused near a narrow window cut low into the stone. There, resting within the sill's wooden frame, was a small wooden soldier, hand-carved, its paint faded by time and handling. One of its eyes, a bead inset into the face, had been removed, leaving behind an emptiness more unsettling than injury. Holmes bent swiftly, lifted it without comment, and slipped it into his coat. He turned to me as if nothing had occurred and murmured, "It seems someone has left a watchman in place." "Left?" I echoed. "Or perhaps forgotten," he replied, continuing his walk with an air of thoughtfulness that offered no further explanation. But something in the child's toy, its neglect or its nearness to that sealed wing, left a quiet pressure upon the mind. As we made our return toward the central chambers of the house, I noticed Holmes's gait change subtly. He no longer moved with the casual observer's detachment, but with a deliberation that marked the measuring of space. He paused at corners and turned sharply upon his heel at certain intersections of shadow and light. At one point, he bent and marked the pattern of creaking boards with the pressure of his cane, tapping once, then again, then stepping back with a frown of approval. "Curtains, Watson," he said softly. "Speak more eloquently than the men who draw them." I raised a brow. "Note which windows gather dust evenly, and which, despite the claimed disuse, show the gentler marks of breath upon glass." We passed into the gallery adjoining the east wing. Holmes allowed his fingers to brush the wall beside the lintel of a bricked arch. "You've not asked me again about the girl," I said. He did not answer for a moment. Then, as if addressing the floor itself, he said, "When one is presented with a ghost, it is best first to see whether the floorboards recognize her tread." That night, as the house surrendered to its long nocturne of silence and sealed doors, I observed Holmes by candlelight, hunched over a small desk near the hearth. He made no sound save the faint scrape of pencil on paper, his brows drawn together with the intensity of a cartographer mapping a coastline known only to memory and rumour. Across the page unfolded a detailed sketch of the east corridor, precise to the inch, with annotations in his thin hand. Uneven floor, slight draught near wainscot, light exposure at 9:17 p.m. He worked as though charting the architecture of a vanished truth. Evening had fallen over Renston Grange with a melancholy grace, and the household had retreated to its usual hush, a silence not born of peace, but of careful arrangement. Holmes and I had withdrawn to the small study allocated to us for the duration of our stay. Though sparse and austere, it served Holmes's needs, for he required only light, ink, and a table large enough to bear the weight of evidence. The candle beside him flickered gently as he unfolded a document from his leather satchel and smoothed it across the desk. "You may find this of interest, Watson," he said, tapping the top edge with a slender forefinger. I leaned in. It was a copy of the inquest into the death of one Eliza Cowishaw, aged 11, female, cause of death, pulmonary phthisis or consumption. The report bore the official seal of the county coroner's office and was neatly written, almost too neatly, with signatures appended at the foot like ornaments rather than affirmations. "The house has tried to forget her," Holmes murmured, "but the dead are often less forgiving of silence than the living." The inquest detailed that Eliza had been seen last by a nurse of temporary employment and attended by Dr. Sebastian Penry, formerly of Midhurst. No mention was made of illness prior to the final fortnight. No family statements, no priest. It was all curiously bloodless. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Now, Watson, let us consider who was meant to read this, and who was meant not to." He handed me the inquest form once more, this time pointing to the lower margin where the physician's signature lay, clear, crisp, and final. Sebastian Penry, M.D., March 22nd, 1887. "There," Holmes said quietly. "Now compare that with this." He produced a small clipping from a local paper, browned with age, but intact. It bore the sombre heading, "Death of Dr. Penry," and the date affixed to its header was unmistakable. January 10th, 1887. "You see it?" he asked. "The doctor signed this inquest report more than 2 months after he had himself passed away," I replied, the words heavy in my mouth. "Just so," Holmes said, lacing his fingers before him. The inquest bears a date that should not exist, and thus did not. This, my dear Watson, is not merely a clerical inconsistency. It is a fiction passed into the ledgers of the law. But surely such an error. Errors are plausible in haste, in panic, even in grief. But this, he said, is precision. The report has been written not to convince a coroner, but to pacify a conscience. I looked again at the false document, and suddenly the ordered columns of ink and facts seemed hollow, as if the page itself had known the truth and kept it quiet for years. Holmes rose and walked to the hearth. We must now ask, Watson, if Eliza did not die, where then was she placed? Holmes stood before the cold grate, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, the other folded behind his back in that familiar posture of brooding clarity. I observed in him that peculiar stillness which always heralded some deeper reckoning, not merely with facts, but with what lay beneath them. There is something too smooth in this tale, Watson, he said. A child of delicate health, taken by consumption, a respectable sorrow, a sealed wing, preserved out of sentiment, servants who speak only in the conditional, and a master who has grown skilled at silence. It fits too neatly. You believe the girl was not ill. I believe she may have been inconvenient. He turned and retrieved the toy soldier from his pocket, the one found near the corridor window. He placed it gently upon the table between us. A child who watched, a child who remembered, one who perhaps saw more than she ought, and was thus removed, not to the grave, but to the shadows of her own home. I stared at the wooden figurine, its one-eyed gaze now seeming almost accusatory. You suspect she still lives? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he lifted the cracked mirror we had found earlier and aligned it with the candle's flame. The reflection fractured. People hide things, Watson, he said at last. Not always because they are evil, but because they are afraid. The question now is not who has lied, but why. And the silence that followed seemed to breathe with the weight of a house not yet finished lying. I had long since learned to expect the peculiar interludes of independent inquiry that often accompanied Holmes's investigations. It was during one such interval, whilst Holmes scoured the architectural features of the eastern wing with what he termed unfeigned aimlessness, that I turned my attention to the inquest's only other named individual, Nurse Agnes Bellamy. Her name, mentioned only once in the death report, had struck me as curiously isolated, devoid of title, age, or origin. I made discreet inquiries to the parish registry and reviewed the employment ledgers kept at the nearby almshouse, which occasionally provided domestic staff to surrounding estates. To my quiet unease, I found her name entered but once, noted as temporary attendance, with her tenure lasting less than 3 weeks. The end date? Precisely aligned with the supposed death of Eliza Cowishaw. There was no address left, no letter of departure, no forwarding contact. She had, in all administrative terms, vanished. Holmes listened without expression as I relayed the findings over supper. When I concluded, he merely nodded once and replied, "A nurse who disappears on the day a child supposedly dies. Watson, it is not death that I distrust. It is convenience." His words, though coolly delivered, lingered as the lamplight dimmed around us. Later that evening, I stepped alone into the garden. The fog had retreated to the lower hedges, and the air bore the strange, slightly sour scent of damp brick. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as I made my way to the far side of the lawn, directly opposite the east wing. The window was there. Still, no lamp glowed behind the glass. No curtain stirred. And yet I could not shake the image that had been planted in my mind. The same figure Miss Venn had described with such trembling clarity. A child's silhouette, unmoving, watching. There, in the stillness, and with the distance of Holmes's logic temporarily behind me, a strange notion took root. Could it be, I wondered, that we were not witnessing deception, but something more dreadful? That the girl who appeared at the window was not living at all? That her presence was not physical, but something suspended in the very timbers of the house? When I rejoined Holmes indoors, I hesitated, then confessed my thought aloud. He listened without comment, and only after a long pause replied, "You are a man of medicine, Watson, yet even the physician may mistake the whisper of guilt for the rustle of spirits." Holmes sat once more before the hearth, his long fingers steepled before him, the candlelight illuminating the inward cast of his gaze. It was the look he wore when his mind turned not merely toward deduction, but to what he once called the darker arithmetic of the human soul. "I have no need to disprove your theory of spirits," he said at last, "for I find the mortal explanation far more chilling." He reached for his notebook, where he had sketched the household's room arrangements with cold precision. "Let us assume," he continued, "that Eliza did not die, that her death was orchestrated, not by poison or violence, but by erasure. In such a case, one might forge a death, procure a falsified report, and then—" "Concealment," I said. "Just so, but concealment of what?" He turned a page. "I propose not only a child concealed, but perhaps a substitution arranged, a child removed, and another left in her place. Or perhaps, more tragically, no child at all." I frowned. "Then who or what appears at the window?" Holmes closed the notebook gently. "Memory, Watson, and the echoes that memory casts when it is fed by guilt and fear. A lie, if well planted, grows deeper roots than truth. And in this house, something has been carefully cultivated in silence." The candle beside Holmes had burned low, its flame bending beneath a soft draught that whispered through the floorboards. He folded the inquest neatly and set it aside with the precision of a surgeon placing a scalpel back in its velvet case. He did not speak for some time. Then, without lifting his gaze, he said, "There is a form of silence, Watson, which serves not to honour grief, but to disguise its absence." The room had grown colder. I turned my eyes once more toward the plan he had drawn, its crisp lines laid across the paper like veins in a corpse, silent, ordered, and awaiting breath. Whatever truth lingered behind the shuttered glass of the east wing, it was not dead. It had simply gone unspoken long enough to convince its keepers that silence was safety. Holmes leaned back and said only, "It is time the house remembered what it chose to forget." The night descended with that peculiar hush, which in England often heralds neither storm nor serenity, but something older, a waiting. Holmes had instructed that we dine early and retire not to our rooms, but to the edge of the south hedge, where the gardens gave way to the orchard, and from thence one might obtain a clear, oblique view of the east wing. He brought with him a compact field glass of German make, and I a pocket watch and journal. We crouched behind the yew hedge shortly before 9, the moon sailing pale and patient above the dormered roof. Holmes had chosen our position with that uncanny instinct of his, concealed from all windows, and yet placed so that we might observe 3 in the east wing, each drawn with heavy curtains. "The hour is predictable," he murmured, "which means deliberate." I did not reply. There was in the air the subtle tension that precedes revelation, not dramatic, but brittle. The grass beneath us was wet, the bark of the apple trees flaking in the moonlight like old skin. We watched and waited, and felt the house watch too, not merely through its windows, but with something more ancient than glass. There is a certain category of English country house, not large enough to boast of history, but too proud to acknowledge decline, which develops over time, a sentience peculiar to itself. Renston Grange, in those hours between supper and midnight, felt not like a dwelling, but a creature trained to stillness. Holmes, peering through the telescope with the same composure he might apply to a microscope slide, offered a low comment. "Observe, Watson. The light in the middle window is not so constant as the others. It flickers slightly, as though someone tends it at irregular intervals. The servants' hall, perhaps?" "There is no firelight in the servants' quarters this side of the house," he replied. "That window belongs to the east nursery, or rather, belonged." The air pressed in around us, dense with earth and something less nameable. Somewhere beyond the orchard, an owl called once and ceased. Holmes adjusted the lens slightly. "It is not the movement that interests me," he murmured. "It is the precision. A presence which repeats itself with mechanical reliability is not accident. It is intention." His words seemed to linger long after the wind had ceased to stir the branches. My watch, which I had consulted perhaps 30 times in the last half hour, now ticked within a single minute of the appointed time. I glanced toward Holmes, whose expression had not shifted from its curious repose, save for the tightening of the jaw, which I knew well. Then, at precisely 9:17, it happened. The centre window, third from the left as Miss Venn had described, shifted, not the whole curtain, only the inner edge. It moved slowly, as though drawn by a hand hesitant either from caution or custom. A pale lamplight shone from within, and in that faint square of illumination a figure emerged. It was not imagination, it was not wind, nor trick of glass. There, beyond the pane, stood the form of a girl, small, narrow-shouldered, her head slightly inclined. She did not move. She simply stood, as if posing for a portrait never to be finished. My mouth went dry. I tried to summon rational explanation. A servant, perhaps, or some clever ruse. But even before I could speak, I knew those words would ring hollow. "She is there," I whispered. "She has been there," Holmes corrected gently, not taking his eyes from the glass. "And she will be there again." He closed the telescope and handed it to me, without another word. I looked again, but the curtain had drawn itself shut. The window, and whatever stood behind it, had vanished back into the silence. We returned to the house without discussion. Holmes maintained his usual stride, not hurried, but charged with the air of a man who had now seen what he expected. I, on the other hand, found myself unable to reconcile the image with the laws of the world I knew. Inside, the lamps burned low in the corridor. The staff had retired. Only the creak of the stair and the echo of our boots testified that Renston Grange remained awake. In our chamber, I turned to Holmes. "There can be no deception," I said, more to myself than him. "No projection, no mirror trick. I saw her with my own eyes." "Quite so. And yet," I paused. "She made no movement, no gesture. She did not pace or knock, nor even turn, only stood." Holmes sat at the writing table and began to note a series of angles in his ledger. Window height, candle position, time. "There are moments, Watson," he said without looking up, "when the absence of motion is more telling than its presence. What remains, still in the face of witness, does not hide. It waits." His pencil scratched across the paper. "She was not surprised to be seen. That, my friend, is what disturbs me." We made our way down again well past midnight, the house slumbering under its facade of decay. Holmes had requested I accompany him for a brief circuit around the eastern facade. "For the air," he claimed, though his boots were already laced and his pocket contained the narrow blade he used for tight locks and rusted hinges. The moon had dimmed behind a cloud. We moved carefully around the gravelled path, our steps muffled against the moss-lined stones. Holmes paused before the very window we had observed hours prior, now dark and unremarkable. He crouched beside it with a precision born of familiarity. "There," he said quietly. I knelt beside him. Just within the sill, pressed into the outer wooden sash and half obscured by the warped frame, was a ribbon, pale blue, frayed at the edge. It had not been placed. It had been caught, as if someone had closed the window hastily, unaware that it had dragged through the edge. Holmes withdrew it carefully and examined the fibres. Child's, cotton, aged, but not from a decade past. This has seen light in recent months. He glanced at the sill. Note the wear, faint drag marks, as from repeated opening. Despite Mr. Cowlishaw's claim, this window has not remained sealed. And it opens from the inside, I murmured. Holmes pocketed the ribbon and stood slowly. There is movement in this house, he said. Not of ghosts, but of people who hope to pass as such. We returned at last to the study, the hour creeping beyond 2. Holmes lit the candle afresh and returned to his notes with the same clinical calm he had maintained throughout the evening. His pencil moved with crisp economy, mapping the angles from garden to window, the dimensions of light fall, and the fixed time of appearance. I waited a while before asking, "And what conclusion do you draw, Holmes?" He set down the pencil, but did not answer at once. Instead, he reached for the ribbon and placed it on the table beside the wooden soldier. One artifact of childhood, one of concealment. "We are close," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Too close, perhaps, for comfort." "Close to what?" He met my gaze then. Not with triumph, but something closer to sorrow. "There are truths, Watson, which reveal themselves only when we are prepared to accept what they imply. This is not merely a question of whether a girl appears at a window, but why she does not leave it." He stood and extinguished the candle with a slow breath. "Tomorrow, the house will speak. Whether it lies or not, I intend to hear it." The morning after our nocturnal discovery broke with a brittle sunlight and the soundless gravity one associates not with peace, but with postponed reckoning. The household assembled as usual for breakfast, yet nothing about the scene struck me as ordinary. The silver was polished, the tea poured, and the eggs brought in warm from the stove, but all transpired beneath a hush that seemed to cling to the tablecloth and settle in the folds of the napkins. Mr. Cowlishaw sat at the head, his gaze fixed not on us, but on the cut-glass carafe at his right hand, as though searching in its refractions for a past version of himself. He was paler than I'd seen him. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for his spoon, and his responses to Miss Venn's polite inquiries were perfunctory at best. Holmes, for his part, remained as placid as ever, speaking little, eating less. He observed everything: the stiffness of Cowlishaw's shoulders, the repeated clearing of the throat, the slight flinch when the word nursery was mentioned. I could tell, by the faint crease between his brows, that Holmes had reached his conclusion, and that, for now, he chose to let the silence ripen before cutting it clean. As the last of the toast was removed and the footman dismissed, Holmes laid his napkin aside with care and said, almost pleasantly, "Might I trouble you for a word in private, Mr. Cowlishaw?" We convened in the drawing-room, Holmes, Cowlishaw, and myself. The latter moved with the weary acquiescence of a man who has awaited this moment for too long and hoped it might pass him by unseen. The door was shut, the curtains half drawn. The light, pale and slanting through aged lace, gave the impression of a room half awake and uncertain it wished to be. Holmes stood at the fireplace, hands behind his back, not looking at Cowlishaw, but at the embers cooling in the grate. "Mr. Cowlishaw," he began, his tone level, "the forged inquest, the concealed corridor, the toy soldier, and the ribbon, taken together they form not a mystery, but a confession." Cowlishaw said nothing. His breathing had quickened almost imperceptibly. "You claimed Eliza Cowlishaw died of consumption in 1887, and yet the physician who signed her death certificate had already been in his grave for 10 weeks. The nurse who supposedly cared for her disappeared without trace, and the East Wing, allegedly sealed, has been entered and exited by a small person in recent months." Still Cowlishaw was silent. He stared at the hearth as if it might offer a last refuge. "I put it to you," Holmes continued, now turning, "that Eliza did not die. She was hidden, confined, perhaps cruelly, perhaps with misjudged mercy. And I further assert that the girl Miss Venn saw at the window is not Eliza, but her child, Lucy. You have hidden 2 children, not 1. Cowishaw opened his mouth. No words came, only a long, shuddering breath. Cowishaw sank into the nearest chair, his hands clutched at the armrests as though they might anchor him to some reality still within reach. When he spoke, his voice was rasped and ragged, like pages turned too fast. "She was not right," he said at last. "Eliza, from the age of 8. The fits began. Terrible things. Screaming at shadows, tearing at her own skin, muttering in languages she could not have known. The doctors, such as they were, had no answers." He paused. A hand went to his brow. "And then there was the night she tried to set fire to the linen press. My wife, God rest her, said we must send her away. But I could not bear the thought of the asylums. You do not know what they are. Not truly. I saw them once, as magistrate. No child belongs there." "And so you locked her here?" I asked quietly. "She lived in the East Wing, with a nurse at first. We told the staff she had died. In time they believed it. The inquest was arranged. It seemed kinder that way." Holmes said nothing. Cowishaw continued. "Eliza died. Truly died, 4 years ago. But she had a child, Watson. A girl. Born in silence. Raised in greater silence. Lucy. She is," he swallowed, "she is all that's left. And I could not bring myself to end her world as I ended Eliza's." Holmes stepped forward now with renewed directness. "I must ask you, Mr. Cowishaw, where is the key?" The old man looked up, his eyes watering not from tears, but from something more desolate, a lifetime of withheld truths. For a moment he said nothing, and I wondered whether his mind had retreated from us entirely. Then, slowly, he reached to the drawer beneath the escritoire and drew out a thin iron key, blackened with age, but polished at the teeth from repeated use. He set it gently upon the table, as one might place a coin upon a grave. Holmes took it without a word and turned on his heel. "Come, Watson." We followed the narrow corridor beyond the gallery, the shadows thickening as the wallboards closed about us. At its end stood a panel, featureless but for a faint seam and a tiny keyhole nearly invisible in the wainscot. Holmes inserted the key and turned it. With a creak dry as dust, the panel swung inward, revealing a short passage no wider than a cupboard. The air that issued forth was stale and tinged with something sweet, like faded perfume left too long in a drawer. We stepped inside. It was time to meet the girl at the window. The passage ended in a door scarcely more than a plank with hinges, behind which lay a narrow chamber, no more than 10 feet by 8, furnished with a low bed, a stool, and a small table bearing a teacup and a brass lamp whose wick had long since burned dry. Dust clung to the rafters, and the curtains, thin muslin scraps pinned to the frame, had yellowed with time. There, seated in the corner as though part of the stillness itself, was a girl. She made no sound as we entered. Her eyes, wide and pale as moonstone, blinked once against the lamplight Holmes lit and held aloft. Her hair was cropped short, her hands folded in her lap with a care that suggested instruction rather than instinct. "Lucy?" Holmes said gently. No reply. She watched us not with fear, but with the flat resignation of a creature long accustomed to inspection and denial. When I stepped forward and knelt beside her, she did not recoil. She looked at me, through me, and then back at the wall, as though my shape would soon fade. Holmes bent to examine the windowsill. A thin fray in the muslin showed where the ribbon had once been caught. "She has stood here," he murmured, "again and again, not to escape, but to be seen. It was the most chilling truth of all, that the girl had not cried out. She had simply waited, hoping that one day someone might finally answer. Lucy was led gently from the room by Miss Venn, whose calm hand and whispered assurances steadied what my medical knowledge could not. The girl clung to her arm, as though the touch were the first real thing she had known. Holmes had already summoned the local physician and arranged for the constable at Midhurst to be discreetly informed. Yet it was clear to both of us, as we stood in the crumbling passage, that no criminal charge would hold. Cowlishaw's actions, though morally indefensible, were not easily defined in law. There had been no formal guardianship revoked, no institution from which she was unlawfully withdrawn, only silence, long, calculated, and unbroken. And silence, in England, is often considered a virtue when worn with sufficient sorrow. Cowlishaw, white as the dust upon the keys he had hidden, sat alone in his study, and no hand moved to restrain him. As we stepped from the east wing into the fading gold of afternoon, Holmes paused at the threshold, one hand upon the decayed wood. "The law may sleep," he said softly, "but conscience wakes at night." I glanced back at the window, now dark, now truly empty, and could not help but wonder whether the ghost of Renston Grange had ever been a ghost at all. Holmes walked on ahead, but I lingered a moment longer. Some crimes, I thought, leave no blood. Only dust where a child once stood waiting, and silence too deep for absolution. It was on one of those grey April evenings that London does so well, the sort where the damp seems to cling not only to the streets, but to the very thoughts of the city, that I found myself once more within the familiar lodgings at Baker Street. Outside, the fog curled its pale fingers around the gas lamps and drew a veil across the rooftops like mourning lace. Holmes sat in his usual chair, bent attentively over a watchmaker's lens and a small twist of frayed silk thread, his long fingers manipulating the object with a concentration I had come to associate more with meditation than mere study. A coil of pipe smoke hovered above his head, turning in ghostly spirals before vanishing upward into the gloom. The fire burned low, and the room bore that comfortable air of old volumes, Turkish tobacco, and quiet menace. For one never knew whether Holmes' silence betokened repose or some deep and icy deduction still taking form. "Have you been thinking of Cowlishaw?" I asked at last. Holmes did not answer immediately. He merely nodded once, then adjusted the lens with deliberate care and murmured, "Of him, yes, but more so, of the things men choose to bury while pretending they are being kind." I turned my gaze to the window, where the fog pressed thickly against the panes, rendering the familiar streets below into shifting abstracts of motion and gaslight. And in that moment, my thoughts returned, as they often did, to the faces of those two children, born of the same blood, yet bound by chains of different kind. Eliza Cowlishaw, a name which will never appear in any register beyond the one falsified to declare her dead. Her existence, as far as society is concerned, ended with a signature forged in haste and buried under propriety. And Lucy, that pale, silent child discovered behind a wall, like an old painting someone had grown ashamed to hang, she too shall vanish from the ledgers of polite memory, even as she begins to recover breath and speech and strength. They will haunt no court. No headline will speak their story. For there are crimes which English society prefers to forget, not because they are minor, but because they reflect too clearly the tremors beneath its own varnished calm. I wonder, sometimes, whether they themselves shall learn to forget, or whether each step they take in quiet rooms and behind drawn curtains will echo with the footsteps they were not allowed to take when the world still called them daughters. "Lucy," I said aloud, half to myself. Will she ever know what her name might have meant, had it not been buried with her mother's? And Holmes, without looking up, replied simply, "She may know, but she will never be permitted to say it." Holmes set down his lens and drew from the cluttered table a pale envelope sealed in green wax. With one swift motion, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter within, scanning it in silence before handing it to me. "Miss Venn writes again," he said. "Read it aloud, Watson, if you please." I did so. "My dear Mr. Holmes, Lucy has begun to speak in whispers, only in the early morning, when the frost has not yet lifted and the birds are still quiet. Her words are simple, colours, shapes, sometimes numbers, never names. I do not press her. She places her hand on mine when I grow still beside her, as if to reassure me that she still exists, though I have begun to suspect that her idea of self is only just forming. She draws, Mr. Holmes, always in a circle, never beyond it. I cannot say whether she is mapping her prison or her world. There is some talk in the village of moving her to a convalescent home near Guildford, though I resist it. The matron there has no patience for girls who flinch from their name. It grieves me to say this, but the villagers do not ask about her. They prefer that she remain a curiosity left unspoken. Secrets, it seems, are more acceptable than discomfort. I shall remain with her until the window means something more than memory. Yours, faithfully, E. Venn. I folded the letter in silence and returned it to Holmes. The room seemed colder then, despite the fire, and I could not help but think how England, in its careful cruelty, builds quieter prisons than stone could ever manage. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the hearth, warming his long hands above the fire, as though seeking to thaw not his fingers but something more deeply chilled within. He stood thus for some time before speaking, his voice low and tinged with that rare trace of feeling he allowed only when the room had earned its silence. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said, "how justice and cowardice wear the same coat when cut from the cloth of politeness." I raised an eyebrow, though said nothing. "You see," he continued, "men are praised not for truth, but for the discretion with which they avoid it. Cowishaw was not mad, nor monstrous. He did not act from hatred or appetite. He was simply afraid of scandal, of whispered judgments, of the disruption of that delicate illusion we call family honour." He turned then, facing me squarely. "It is easy to despise the man who harms from anger. It is much harder to name the man who harms from shame. For he hides not behind rage, but behind respectability. A sealed wing, a death certificate, a white glove dropped over the wound. And yet," I murmured, "the wound festers still." "Precisely," said Holmes, "and London is full of such wounds, bleeding behind closed doors, where the curtains are drawn just so, and the maid instructed never to speak of the child upstairs." He resumed his seat. "The law punished neither Cowishaw nor the society that formed him, but I fear the damage is not done with them yet. I have often walked since then, through the fog-bound squares of Bloomsbury, or along the river walks near Lambeth, and found myself thinking of Renston Grange, not as a house, but as a silence. The window at the far eastern wing, once so vividly described by Miss Venn as flickering with childish movement behind the drapery, remains, I am told, forever drawn now. No hand twitches the cloth. No pale face presses to the glass. It is not peace one feels when gazing upon it, only absence. For some, that stillness might be comfort, a neat ending, a mystery concluded. But I, who have seen too many lives buried beneath polite conclusion, wonder whether silence is always a release, or merely another layer of concealment. I asked Holmes once, as we crossed Russell Square in the fading light, whether he believed the truth had set Lucy free. "She is alive," he answered. "Is that enough?" "It must be, Watson," he replied, "for it is the only freedom she was allowed, and that, I think, is why the curtain never moved again, not from peace, but from the kind of quiet that no longer waits to be seen." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled, his expression fixed, not upon me, but upon some thought he had not yet invited the world to hear. "Watson," he said at last, "there is a particular variety of blindness which afflicts the otherwise sound of mind. It is not born of illness or age, but of preference, of deliberate, cultivated aversion." I nodded, sensing the conclusion nearing. "It is not always the hidden thing which damns a man," Holmes continued, his voice barely above the fire's low crackle, but his decision never to look at it again. He stood and returned to the windowsill, where the mist of London still hovered like a veil drawn across memory. "Cowishaw chose not to see," he went on, "not Eliza's suffering, nor the consequence of his silence, and the world, most obligingly, allowed him that luxury, provided, of course, that he dressed it in enough grief to pass for virtue." I rose and joined him. "And yet," I said, "you chose to see. You always do." He smiled faintly, and not with pride, but with something colder. "And that, my dear Watson, is why I do not sleep as easily as most men." Then he turned back to the fire, set down his lens upon the table beside the coals, and said no more. But in that room of smoke, silence, and cooling tea, the truth hung between us still, not as judgment, but as the shadow of what England prefers never to name. As the embers in the hearth sank into a quiet glow, Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There is something peculiarly English," he said at last, "in the manner we choose to bury truth beneath etiquette. Cowlishaw's crime was not born of madness, but of cowardice, a terror not of the law, but of scandal." I looked into the fire, uncertain whether I felt pity or revulsion. Holmes continued softly, "To lock away what we fear does not banish it. It only ensures it watches us from the dark. What do you believe was Cowlishaw's gravest mistake? Concealing the girl, forging the inquest, or believing silence could absolve the soul? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this mystery stirred something in you, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing it with a fellow lover of the strange and hidden.